Emily and Huntley have been friends since childhood. They shared common dreams, faith, and a desire to change the world. Their lives were spent in a small conservative community, where the rules were unshakable, and each family strictly ensured that the children followed their chosen path. When they turned 17, the girls began to participate in a church mission. The goal was noble: to spread the word of God, to help those in need and, of course, to strengthen faith. "We had a rare opportunity to talk to Mr. Reed," Huntley said, looking through the list of addresses. "Is this the strange man that everyone is whispering about?" Emily asked, frowning. "Strange? Well, they say he used to be a scientist, but now he lives as a hermit. Maybe he just found God?" Huntley suggested with genuine optimism. Their task was simple: to talk to Mr. Reed about faith, ask a few questions for their school-wide project on morality and choice, and then return to the church. The streets were quiet and deserted when the girls reached the house. The high fence, the peeling paint on the walls, and the massive wooden door were slightly disturbing. "Is that him?" Emily nodded at the house. "Yes. Don't worry, everything will be fine," Huntley replied, knocking on the door. The door opened. In front of them stood a man in his 50s with a neat beard and a soft smile. "Good afternoon, girls. How can I help you?" "What is it?" he asked, looking at them with friendly curiosity. "We wanted to talk to you about faith and life choices," Huntley began. "We are doing a project for the church and—" "How interesting," Mr. Reed interrupted them, opening the door wider. "Come in, my wife is just baking a pie. I think it would be nice for you to have a little snack while we talk." The house looked unusual inside. Everything was neat but gloomy: dark wooden panels on the walls, thick curtains covering the windows. There was a strange statue in the corner with a raised hand, as if calling for someone to stop. "Sit down, girls," Reed pointed to an old but clean sofa. Emily and Huntley exchanged glances, but obeyed. The man sat down opposite, curling his fingers in his lap, and smiled. "So you want to talk about faith? But you know, talking about faith is always a conversation about choice. What do you think is more important, to listen to what you are told, or to do as you see fit?" "Of course, to listen to the instructions of the elders," Huntley replied quickly, but her confidence was noticeably strained. "And if the instructions are wrong? If you've been told since childhood that the way to the light is through humility, but humility makes you weak? What then?" Emily looked at her friend, but she was silent. "I'm not sure," Emily finally said. "Sometimes humility is really useful, but it should not deprive a person of freedom." Reed clapped his hands. "A wonderful answer," he exclaimed. "You know, I've been studying these issues for a long time. And I came to the conclusion that the world is a place where right decisions often lead to wrong consequences." "How's that?" asked Huntley, surprised. "Let me show you an example," he said, getting up. "Follow me." Mr. Reed led them into the next room. There was a large board with a lot of pictures, each of which represented someone's fate: a happy family, a destroyed house, a soldier on the battlefield, a woman behind bars. "Take this woman, for example," Reed said, pointing to the photo. "Her name was Margaret. She chose a family and gave up her career. A good choice, isn't it? But what happened when her husband left her with 3 children? She ended up on the street." The girls listened with bated breath. Mr. Reed walked slowly along the board, his fingers sliding over the photographs, as if he was recalling every incident in great detail. "Here's another example," he began, pointing to a photograph of a man in a formal suit. "This is Michael. He chose a career, giving his whole life to it. A great choice, isn't it? Build yourself, succeed, earn money. But do you know how it ended? At 50, he was completely alone. His wife could not stand the eternal absence of her husband, the children grew up and did not feel affection for him. He died in his apartment, surrounded by what he considered important: awards, watches, money. And his body was found only 2 weeks later. Emily shuddered, unable to take her eyes off the photo. "It's just a tragic accident," Huntley said, trying to ease the tension somehow. "Really? Now look at this woman. This is Sarah. She dedicated her life to helping others. She worked for charities, visited hospitals, and fed the homeless. A real example of virtue. But when she needed help herself, none of those she had once helped even thought about her. She died alone, forgotten by everyone. But this is also wrong," Emily exclaimed, her voice trembling. "She's done so many good things." "Exactly," Reed replied coldly, "and that's the whole point. Whatever you choose, the world will continue to spin as it pleases. Everything you do doesn't matter to others." He turned to the girls, and his eyes shone with a strange fire. "And this photo," he pointed to the image of a man holding a small child in his arms. "This is my father. He chose a family. He worked so that we didn't need anything. He was a loving husband and a caring father. And do you know what happened? One day, on his way back from work, he was hit by a car. The driver didn't even stop. And I stayed with my mother, who broke down without him, and I grew up in a world where his ideals did not save him or us." The girls were silent. Reed's words sounded like an accusation to the whole world. "So everything is meaningless?" Huntley whispered, her voice trembling. Reed suddenly laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter. "No, not at all. It's not pointless. It's just a reality. You can choose any path, but do not think that the world will reward you." He pointed to another photo, a group of young people with smiles on their faces. These guys decided to go against the system. They rejected all the rules, lived the way they wanted. And where are they now? One died of an overdose, another is in prison, and the third was admitted to a psychiatric clinic. But there has to be a right way. Emily couldn't stand it. Someone should be happy. Reed frowned, his gaze heavy. "Happiness? It's just a chemical reaction in your brain," he said. "It's not worth chasing after him. It is much more important to understand that the world is a game that you cannot win. All you can do is play in a way that leaves your mark." He walked over to the table and took out a small notebook. "Here's a task for you," he said, putting the notebook on the table in front of the girls. "My rules of life are written here. Read them and tell me which ones are correct and which are not." Emily and Huntley looked at each other, their hands shaking as they opened the notebook. On the first page it was written, "Never listen to those who promise easy ways. Help others, but only if it doesn't destroy you. Love is a weakness that needs to be controlled. Family is a duty, not a choice. People use each other to make themselves feel better. Every choice is a step towards your ultimate goal, but not happiness." "It's terrible," Emily whispered, her voice shaking with shock. "Now think about it, which of these rules could save the lives of the people I've told you about?" Huntley closed her notebook and looked at Reed. "But if that's the case, why choose anything at all?" The man grinned. "That, my dear, is the most important question." "And you found the answer to it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling, but there was already a challenge in her eyes. Reed looked at her thoughtfully. There was a hint of fatigue in his gaze, but he quickly pulled himself together. "I found something that works for me," he replied. "Each of us decides for himself how to live his life. But I'll give you a hint, there is no right answer." Emily felt anger building inside her. "So everything we do is just useless? You make us believe that every choice is doomed to failure in advance." Reed slowly approached her, his face tense, but his gaze remained calm. No, Emily, you misunderstood me. Everything you do matters. Just not for the world. But for you. But how to live knowing that everything can end like this? How are these photos? Handley spoke loudly for the first time, her voice ringing with desperation. Reed took a deep breath, as if he was about to say something important. Realize this, the only truth in life is yourself. The world does not owe you happiness, justice, or even meaning. All you have is your choices and their consequences. If you can accept it, you will be free. Are you free? Emily asked. Yes, Reed said firmly, free from other people's expectations, from the fear of mistakes, from the desire to please. The girl sat in silence, considering his words. The whole house seemed to freeze, listening to this strange conversation. But then what to do? Handley finally asked. Emily and Huntley were silent for a long time after Reed's words, thinking about them until the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Emily, who was the bolder of the two, finally broke the silence. You know, it bothers me that he talks so confidently about the choice, but at the same time keeps all these photos here. Why does he need this? Handley nodded, though there was still uncertainty in her eyes. Maybe this is some form of punishment? Or, a reminder? She suggested. Emily got to her feet and looked around. Attention was drawn to a massive door at the end of the room, partially hidden behind a shelf. Have you noticed this door before? What is it? She asked, pointing at her. Handley frowned. No, it's not. That's not the way out, is it? I don't think so. Emily came closer. Apparently, it leads to the basement. Handley hesitantly followed her. Do you think it's worth going there? And why not? Emily looked at her friend. He left us here, as if he specifically wanted us to find something. Handley didn't seem sure, but she didn't argue. Together they went to the door. The handle was cold to the touch, and the hinges creaked heavily as Emily pulled the door open. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. From the depths came a slight smell of dampness and something metallic. I don't like this, Handley muttered, but Emily had already started down the stairs. We came here to find answers, she replied, stepping deeper into the darkness step by step. When they went down to the basement, they found themselves in a spacious room lit by dim lamps on the ceiling. The room was empty except for a long table in the center, covered with a black cloth. There was a single box on the table. You're the first, Handley breathed, holding back the tremor in her voice. Emily gave her a defiant look and walked over to the box. She just stood there for a minute, looking at it, and then she opened the lid. There was a stack of papers inside, and a small tape recorder underneath. At the very top of the stack was a note with a short inscription. The truth is always deeper than you think. This is too much, Handley muttered, grabbing her hands to keep from shaking. What does it all mean? Emily carefully picked up the tape recorder and pressed the play button. A click, then a hiss, and Reed's voice. If you are listening to this, then you have decided to go further. Congratulations. Now you are at the place where all masks end. There are no right or wrong answers here, but there is only one rule: you have to finish what you started. What does he mean by that? Handley whispered. The voice continued. You will find stories in the box. These are not just documents. These are the steps that people have taken to get to their goals. And each of them ended the same way, a choice that they could not make. Now it's up to you. Emily took the first sheet out of the box. It was a detailed account of a man, his life, his dreams and, the last decision he never made. Does he want us to decide something for them? Handley asked, confused. It looks like it, Emily replied, her voice firmer. I think he wants us to see what it means to take responsibility. Emily and Handley flinched when there was a click behind them. Turning around, they saw the massive door through which they had descended into the basement slowly closing. The girls rushed to her, but belatedly. The door closed with a thud, and soon they heard the metallic sound of a locking mechanism. No, no. Handley tried the handle frantically, but the door wouldn't budge. We're locked up. Emily, trying to remain calm, examined the door. There's no key here, she said, her voice strained. There must be some way out. Suddenly Reed's voice came out of the tape recorder again. I'm glad you found your way to the basement, he said with a barely perceptible sneer. But I have news for you, you won't be able to leave here until morning. What? Handley shouted. You can't lock us in here. It's illegal, Reed continued, ignoring her protests. The door is programmed to open at exactly 6 in the morning. Until then, you will stay here. But don't worry, you won't just have to sit and wait. Emily narrowed her eyes, her gaze becoming suspicious. This is a test, isn't it? You want us to do something while we're here. That's right, Reed confirmed, now you have time to think. To make decisions that others could not make. The box on the table contains everything you need. This is crazy. Handley shouted. We are not going to participate in this. Reed chuckled. You have a choice, he said. But remember that time is running out. And, as in life, you must be prepared for the consequences of your actions, or inaction. Then the recording cut off, leaving the room plunged into an oppressive silence. This is some kind of game, Emily muttered, her gaze focused. He wants us to do something to prove to him, or to ourselves, that we can choose. This is not a game. It's a trap. Handley grabbed her arm. We need to find another way out. Do you think if he just wanted to keep us here, he would have given us this box? Emily asked, nodding at the papers. I don't care what he wanted. Handley was on the verge of panic. We can't sit here and wait for him to decide what to do with us. Emily looked at her carefully. We have no choice. The exit is locked, and nothing will change until morning. If we want to figure this out, we're going to have to do what he's up to. Handley froze, her eyes filled with fear. Are you really going to play by his rules? We have no other choice, Emily replied, taking the first sheet out of the box. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let him control us. Suddenly, there was a rustle in the corner of the room, as if someone was moving in the dark. Emily and Handley froze, their eyes fixed in the direction of the sound. A figure slowly emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her body was almost completely wrapped in dirty, tattered fabrics, and her face was hidden under a hood. Only the dim light coming from a single lamp made it possible to see her eyes, dim, empty, but frighteningly aware. Who are you? Emily's voice sounded harsh, and she reflexively stepped forward, blocking Handley. The woman did not answer. She slowly walked over to the table where the box stood, opened it and, as if ignoring the presence of the girls, took out a small pie wrapped in a piece of oiled paper. Is this yours? Handley asked nervously, her voice trembling. The old woman slowly raised her head, and a weathered, wrinkled skin appeared from under the hood. Her lips stretched into a faint smile. Confessor, she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if torn from years of silence. I came to lighten your burden. What? Emily narrowed her eyes in disbelief. What are you talking about? The woman continued as if she hadn't heard the questions. There is always a choice here. One for everyone. I brought a pie, to help you. She slowly unfolded the paper, and the sweet smell of baking filled the air. But the smell was strange, with a slight chemical bitterness, which made Handley feel her stomach clench. Don't touch it. Emily screamed, but the old woman had already broken off a piece and started chewing, smacking her lips and closing her eyes as if enjoying herself. No. It could be. Handley began, but stopped when she saw the woman's face turn abruptly pale. The old woman made a hoarse sound, her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed to the floor like a bag of bones. White foam began to ooze from her mouth. "Oh my God!" Huntley shouted, stepping back. Emily stared at the woman's body in horror. She slowly came closer, keeping her eyes on the pie, and without touching it, bent down to get a better look at the contents of the box. She's poisoned," she whispered. "Poisoned? But why?" "She brought it herself." Huntley was trembling, her voice full of panic. "It's part of his game," Emily said, trying to sound confident, but her hands were clenched into fists. "This is a warning. He wants us to understand that everything has a price here. Even the food." "But who is she?" Huntley asked, sobbing. "Why did she call herself a confessor?" Emily looked at the woman's body, then at the box. "Maybe she's one of the previous players," she replied. "Maybe she decided to come back, or she was forced to." Suddenly Reed's voice came over the speakers again. "Ah, confessor. I'm always ready to take on someone else's pain. It was her decision, as well as yours. Don't be afraid of her sacrifice, she has lightened your burden. But don't forget, every choice has consequences." Emily and Huntley stood in tense silence, holding their breath. Their eyes couldn't tear themselves away from the woman's body sprawled on the floor. The white foam still dripping from her mouth left traces on the cold wooden floor. There was a smell of death in the room, but at the same time, there was something disturbing, ominous in the air. They were part of this game, and the further they went, the more they felt like it was all consuming them. Suddenly, with a metallic screech, a hatch in the ceiling opened. Emily shuddered and turned around abruptly. The shadow descended, and finally Reed appeared in front of them. He stood in the shadows, his face hidden, but the ominous voice they knew well pierced the silence. "Do you see?" Reed said, stepping into the light. His face was clearly visible now. It expressed neither fear nor regret, only a cold calmness. She chose it herself. No one forced her to eat. It was her choice. Just like yours. Huntley looked up, her eyes full of tears and fear. "But she's dead," she muttered, clenching her fists. "Why did she do that?" Reed tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "Because she realized that everyone is faced with a choice one way or another. Do you understand? She did what she thought was right. I ate the pie because I was looking for relief. After all, we all seek peace, even if it means going through death. It's not a tragedy, it's just part of a cycle. And as you can see, this cycle is my control. I choose how this process will unfold." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Her gaze never left Reed, but her mind was racing with questions. "It's not human." She said it weakly, but Reed chuckled. "Who says I'm not human?" His voice was almost mocking. "We're all more than just meat and bones, one way or another. We are elections, decisions. Have you ever wondered that you don't want to be a light bulb that just burns until it burns out? The light bulb is a metaphor for your life. It shines, but in the end, no one notices it, and it just stops working. Do you really want to be like that? To be the ones who pass by without leaving a trace?" Emily and Huntley were silent, digesting his words. Reed continued, his eyes burning with a bright, restless light. "Every person is faced with the question at some point, what will happen when I stop being needed? When will my ideas, my energy, my light cease to exist? And you can stay in the shadows, exist like a light bulb that burns out, or choose to become something more than just a temporary existence. This is my control, girls. I'm giving you a choice, and you have to understand that it always has consequences. Are you saying that we should be something more?" Emily asked, her voice hoarse with tension. "But how? How do I choose not to be a light bulb? Reed moved closer, his shadow covering the entire room. It's simple. You need to accept the fact that every choice you make is a step towards something more. Even if it's scary. Even if it hurts. But only in this choice will you be able to understand who you really are. People live without realizing that their life is a chain of such small decisions, each of which turns them into someone else. He paused, watching them, and his words seemed to float in the air, penetrating his consciousness. And what will happen to us? Handley asked, her voice trembling. Reed chuckled. It depends on you. But remember, every game ends, and your decisions will be reflected. You won't be able to avoid the consequences, but you can choose which trail to leave behind. Suddenly, while Emily and Huntley were still digesting Reed's words, he took a step forward with such lightning speed that the girls did not have time to react. Reed grabbed one of them by the throat. It was Huntley. She managed to scream, but his hand gripped her neck quickly and tightly, stabbing her in the blink of an eye with a knife that seemed to have been pulled out of thin air. Handley clutched at her throat, trying to pull his hand away, but it was in vain. She looked into his eyes, full of cold ruthlessness, like in a mirror. There was despair and pain in her eyes, and Reed watched with obvious satisfaction as the life gradually left her body. You. Handley's voice was barely audible, like a dying man's whisper. Emily screamed, her panic mixed with horror as she saw blood gushing from the wound on Huntley's throat. Her friend began to lose consciousness, her body trembled, and she fell to the floor like a doll devoid of threads. You do realize, Reed's voice was quiet now, almost philosophical, that every choice has a price. And you can't avoid the consequences. Handley made a choice, and now she, like everyone else here, will pay for it. Emily tried to approach, her heart was in pain for her friend, but something in her body stopped her. Reed's gaze was so commanding that her legs wouldn't obey. You killed her. Emily's voice was filled with rage and pain, but there was no regret in Reed's eyes. She chose, Reed said with a slight sigh, as if her death was just an inevitable element of the whole game. Emily stood there, her heart pounding so loudly that she could barely hear Reed's words. But a thought was already beginning to form in her head, which was burning brighter with every passing moment. Emily felt rage and pain for her friend, for having died in such a cruel and senseless game. Reed killed Huntley with cold blood, as if playing another move in his inhuman game. But inside Emily there was a growing desire, an almost frantic desire to solve all his riddles, to understand what was behind this nightmare, and finally to take revenge. She knew that if she stayed here, if she was afraid, then everything would end the same way. Like with Huntley. And as with the woman who brought the pie. They were all just pawns in Reed's hands. But Emily wasn't ready to be like that. Her decision matured instantly. Her gaze swept across the room. She noticed on the table, next to the box that contained that strange pie, a small knife. It was rather inconspicuous, but Emily immediately felt that this was the very tool she could use. It looked like a sharpener, small, but the point was clearly sharpened in a way that could cause terrible damage. Her fingers were trembling, but she couldn't help herself. Emily crept up to the table and picked up the knife. Its metal blade, despite its small shape, felt in her hand like something more dangerous than she could imagine. It was the same knife that was used to cut the strange pie. Its threat was now in her hands. But what was especially strange was that when she took it, there was suddenly that strange smell in the air that came from the food. Emily felt her body tingle slightly, as if the knife itself carried some strange warmth, unnatural, inseparable from the food itself. She picked up the knife and noticed its shape. It was small, similar to the one used to slice bread or something small, but its point was perfectly sharpened. And something about his warmth, that strange, almost inhuman feeling that it hadn't cooled down yet, made her tense up. Emily looked at Reed, who was still standing, watching her intently. His face expressed nothing but calmness, but she saw his eyes narrow slightly. He didn't expect her to take the knife. It was a risky move, and he seemed to have long since verified that he could control everything around him. She gripped the hilt tighter, her eyes burning with determination. "You can't control me the way you controlled her," Emily said with desperate confidence. "I won't be your pawn." Reed smiled slightly, but his gaze was still cold. "You still don't understand that it's not you who's making the choice. You play by my rules, just like everyone else. Do you think you can take a knife and it will make a difference?" His voice was calm, but his words seemed to be laced with menace. But Emily was no longer listening to him. She came closer, holding the knife in her hands. Her body was trembling with tension, but she felt that everything depended on her now. She couldn't let this go on. This knife is her chance. But not just to survive. It was her weapon, her revenge. She could finally break the circle they were all in. She stood in front of Reed and raised the knife, pointing it resolutely at his chest.